It's 1970. Britain is moving fast, faster than it had in decades. The Beatles have just broken up. Concorde has made its first supersonic flight. The country is standing at the edge of something new, and nobody is quite sure what shape it will take. And on a factory floor in Preston, Lancashire, something rolls off the production line that looks like it escaped directly from a science fiction paperback. It's orange, aggressively, unavoidably, almost offensively orange. It has 3 wheels. Its roof doesn't open sideways like every other car on the road. It tilts forward like the visor on a medieval knight's helmet. 2 seats side by side, close enough that 2 strangers would feel uncomfortable. No conventional doors, no boot worth mentioning, not a single design decision that looks back at what came before. This is the Bond bug, and it is one of the most fascinating stories in British motoring history, not because it succeeded, but because of exactly how and why it didn't. Most people who encountered the bug had one of 2 reactions. Either it was the most forward-thinking, genuinely exciting thing Britain had ever put on a public road, or someone at the factory had completely lost the plot. The truth sits somewhere more complicated than either position, because the bug was genuinely radical. Designed by one of the most visionary industrial designers Britain ever produced. A man whose other work you have almost certainly seen without connecting a name to it. Engineered around a real loophole in British motoring law. Built from lightweight fiberglass, economical, different, brave. And it lasted 4 years. Then it was gone. Quietly and without ceremony, leaving behind just 2,270 examples to tell the whole story. For context on that number, Ford's Dagenham plant was producing more Cortinas than that in a single working day. So, what went wrong? How does a vehicle this genuinely ahead of its time disappear so completely and so fast? The answer is layered. A brilliant designer who never got the follow-through his work deserved. A parent company never truly invested in what it had built. An economic earthquake that rewrote the rules for every manufacturer in Britain. And something harder to quantify, but the quiet collapse of a national mood that the bug had been designed to reflect. By the end of this video, you will see this story differently. Because the Bond bug's failure is not really about a car, it's about what happens when vision arrives without the infrastructure to protect it. To understand the Bond bug, you have to start with Tom Caron. Caron was a Czech-born designer who had come to Britain and joined a small, quietly extraordinary consultancy called Ogle Design, based in Letchworth, Hertfordshire. Ogle didn't manufacture anything themselves. They were the firm you called when you wanted something genuinely new, something with no existing template and no previous version to lean on. Caron's portfolio alone should have made him a household name. He designed the Rally Chopper, that iconic bicycle with the high-rise handlebars and the gear lever mounted in the frame. If you grew up in Britain in the 1970s, you either had one or desperately wanted one. He also designed the Reliant Scimitar GTE, a sports estate that became genuinely fashionable and that Princess Anne drove for years. This was not a man who produced forgettable objects. When the brief arrived for a new 3-wheeled vehicle for the combined Bond and Reliant group, Caron didn't approach it conventionally. He asked a different question from the start. Not what should a small, affordable car look like, but what should movement feel like in 1970? What does a vehicle look like when it believes in the future without reservation? The answer he produced was a wedge, low, forceful, aerodynamic in spirit. The canopy that lifted forward rather than doors that swung out. That wasn't designed for its own sake. That was Caron making a statement about how the past and the future relate to each other. The body was fiberglass throughout, lightweight, resistant to the rust that plagued conventional steel bodywork, and relatively inexpensive to produce in small quantities. The interior was deliberately minimal. Everything surplus to function had been stripped away. And the color, Bug's orange, not a shade from any standard automotive palette, closer to something you'd see on heavy industrial equipment. Vivid, warm, physically demanding on the eye. In its first years, Reliant didn't offer the Bug in any other color, because the color wasn't a finishing detail. The color was the argument. This vehicle is not trying to disappear. Here's where the story turns uncomfortable. While Karen was producing something visionary, the company now responsible for selling it had arrived with entirely different motivations. Reliant had acquired Bond Cars Limited in 1969, just 1 year before the Bug launched. And they hadn't bought Bond because they believed in radical design. They bought Bond to eliminate a competitor. That single decision planted the first seed of the Bug's collapse before the car had turned a wheel in public. In Britain during the 1970s, there was a regulation buried in the motoring laws that most people alive today have never heard of. And yet it was this rule, more than any design award, any trade show appearance, any advertising copy, that was supposed to make the Bond Bug a commercial success. A three-wheeled vehicle weighing less than 860 kilograms unladen could legally be driven on a motorcycle license. Not a full car license, a motorcycle license. In practical terms, for a working man in 1970, this was genuinely meaningful. A full driving license meant lessons, tests, time and money that many families didn't have readily available. A motorcycle license was faster, cheaper, and far more accessible. And if that license could put you inside something enclosed, something with a roof, a heater, and a passenger seat, that was a real proposition, not just a marketing angle. The Bug weighed just under 480 kilograms. It cleared the legal threshold with comfortable room to spare. On paper, the addressable market was enormous. Every driver in Britain who wanted enclosed transportation but didn't yet hold a full license. The reality was considerably more complicated. The launch price of the Bond Bug in 1970 was £629. The average weekly wage for a working man in Britain at the time was approximately £30. That makes the Bug equivalent to roughly 21 weeks of gross pay, just to purchase it, before insurance, before fuel, before the first mechanical issue. And for a similar sum, you could buy a brand new Mini, a proper four-wheeled car with 4 seats, a usable boot, doors that opened without contortion, and a reliability record built over more than a decade of production. The Bug offered 2 seats, minimal luggage capacity, and a canopy with genuine limitations in British weather. The loophole was entirely real. But the value argument was fragile from day one. The Bug had been positioned as the affordable entry point into enclosed motoring. And it wasn't genuinely affordable for the people who most needed that entry. And it was measurably less practical than alternatives already available at the same price. This is the detail that retrospective coverage consistently softens. It gets remembered as a design icon. And it was, but it was also a product with a pricing problem, a practicality problem, and a target market never as large as the license exemption made it appear on paper. And that market was about to get smaller still. Here's what was actually happening inside Reliant while the Bug was being presented to the public as the shape of things to come. Reliant was not, at its core, an adventurous company. Its business was built on producing affordable, reliable, unglamorous transportation for people who needed mobility at the lowest possible running cost. The Bond Bug was genuinely outside that identity, a flashy 2-seat showpiece that attracted attention everywhere it went and translated that attention into sales at a deeply disappointing rate. It was never truly central to Reliant's strategy. It functioned as a satellite project, useful for generating press coverage and trade show enthusiasm, but never allocated the sustained development budget that a revolutionary product needs to mature and improve. Between 1970 and 1974, the Bug received almost no meaningful updates. The engine remained Reliant's existing 700 cubic centimeter unit, solid enough, but unchanged throughout the entire production run. No performance variant, no revised interior, no second body style, no credible attempt to address the practical complaints that buyers and journalists had been raising since the car first appeared. The canopy was a persistent problem. In a country where rain is less a weather event than a permanent ambient condition, a roof prone to condensation and minor leakage mattered. Getting in and out in a public car park without soaking yourself was a genuine inconvenience that owners mentioned consistently. None of it was ever addressed. And then in 1973, Reliant did something that effectively rendered the bug commercially redundant. They launched the Reliant Robin. The Robin had proper doors, a fully enclosed body, a small but functional boot, space for a driver and passengers in reasonable comfort. It was practical, reliably built, and available under exactly the same motorcycle license exemption that had been the bug's primary commercial argument from the beginning. The Robin and the bug were now competing directly for the same finite pool of license-exempt buyers, and the Robin was simply more useful in almost every practical situation. Reliant knew this. They had built it deliberately. The bug was not formally discontinued. It was quietly rendered obsolete by the company that owned it. No farewell model, no announcement, no acknowledgement that something genuinely unusual was leaving the world. Just silence. But the full weight of what came next for the bug had little to do with Reliant's internal decisions, because something was happening in the wider world that would have shaken the bug regardless of what any boardroom decided. October 1973, that is the date when everything changes. On the 6th of October, a coalition of Arab nations launched a military offensive that triggered one of the most consequential geopolitical confrontations of the entire 20th century. The fighting itself lasted less than 3 weeks, but in response to American and Western European support for Israel during the conflict, the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, announced an embargo. They stopped selling oil to the West. The price of oil quadrupled within months. Britain declared a state of emergency. A compulsory 3-day working week was introduced in January of 1974 to conserve electricity. Petrol stations rationed supply. Queues stretched around entire city blocks. People who had never thought twice about where their energy came from were suddenly thinking about almost nothing else. Here is the part that surprises most people. You would expect, logically, that a fuel crisis would benefit a small, light, economical three-wheeler. Lower weight, smaller engine, reduced fuel consumption. Surely this is the moment the bug finally finds its audience. That is not what happened. A crisis of that magnitude doesn't simply alter purchasing preferences. It removes the capacity and the will to purchase at all. The oil shock triggered a deep recession across Britain. Unemployment rose sharply. Inflation climbed to levels that anyone under the age of 60 has no personal frame of reference for. By 1975, it had reached nearly 25%. The purchasing power of ordinary wages was dissolving in real time. In that environment, nobody was spending £629 on a 2-seater novelty vehicle with a canopy and no conventional doors. People were not making aspirational purchases. They were making survival decisions about heating, about food, about whether any non-essential expenditure was responsible at all. The niche, the eccentric, the things bought for experience and identity rather than pure necessity. These are always the first casualties of a genuine crisis. The bond bug occupied exactly that territory. It was, when examined honestly, a luxury product dressed up in the language of economy. When real hardship arrived, that contradiction became impossible to sustain. There is one more dimension to this story, one that goes beyond economics, beyond corporate decisions, beyond oil prices. And it may be the most important factor of all. The 1970s in Britain were not only years of economic difficulty, they were years of psychological dislocation that is genuinely difficult to convey to anyone who didn't live through them. The confidence that had carried the country through the post-war Reconstruction decades, the quiet certainty that things were always moving forward, that tomorrow would be more modern than today, began to crack during this period in ways that ran deeper than any single crisis. It wasn't just petrol prices and electricity rationing, it was a creeping sense that the forward motion had stopped. The Britain that launched the bond bug in 1970 was still holding on to a belief in its own capacity for reinvention. Concord was British. The North Sea oil fields were being developed. British engineering still carried some of the prestige earned in earlier decades. By 1974, that feeling had significantly eroded. Strikes, sustained inflation, political instability, power cuts that left whole streets dark. The national mood had shifted from cautious optimism into something closer to exhausted endurance. And in that mood, a bright orange three-wheeled wedge with a forward-tilting canopy felt less like a symbol of what was coming and more like a slightly uncomfortable reminder of how recently the country had allowed itself to feel hopeful. The car itself hadn't changed. The design was as radical in 1974 as it had been in 1970. The engineering was intact. The license exemption was still valid. But the culture the bug had been built to reflect had quietly moved into a different emotional register, one where conspicuous unconventionality felt like an indulgence the country could no longer justify. A product cannot survive when the culture it was designed for stops showing up. Before we get to what happened after production ended, and the story does not finish in 1974, I want to speak to you directly for a moment. If this is the first time you've found this channel, welcome. We dig into the real stories behind the machines, the decisions, and the moments that shaped the world many of us grew up in. No sanitized version, the actual story with the difficult parts left in. If that's what you want more of, subscribe right now. It costs you nothing and you won't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment below and tell me, what does the bond bug remind you of from your own past? A car you once saw, a product you remember, a moment that felt like the future before it quietly disappeared. I read every single one. Like the video, if it's been worth your time, and if someone you know would appreciate this kind of history, share it with them today. That is genuinely how this channel keeps going. Now, back to the bug, because what happened after 1974 is the part almost nobody tells. The bond bug stopped being produced in 1974, and for a considerable stretch of time afterwards the world seemed content to forget about it. But something quietly remarkable happened over the following decades. The surviving examples, when we see, with only 2,270 ever made, there were never many, began attracting attention of a very different kind, not from the mass market that had passed on them during production, from collectors, from designers, from people who looked back with clear eyes and understood exactly what Tom Caron had been reaching for and how close he had come to something lasting. Today, a well-preserved bond bug in its original bug's orange commands prices that the men who couldn't sell them in 1974 would find extraordinary. Restored examples have appeared at auctions selling for multiples of their original purchase price. The car that couldn't find enough buyers to sustain its own production is now actively sought by people who recognize its place in the history of British design. That is not a small irony. That is the central truth of the entire story. The bond bug did not fail because it was the wrong idea. It failed because it arrived at the wrong moment. Inside a parent company never fully committed to its potential, in an economy that had no room for the non-essential, and within a culture that had quietly stopped believing in the future, it had been designed to celebrate. But the design survived, the idea survived, And more than 50 years later, people are still talking about it, which is more than can be said for the vast majority of vehicles built in that same era. The Bond bug story is not really about a car. It's about what happens when something genuinely new arrives before the world is ready to receive it. And it's about the stubborn, persistent way that real quality refuses to disappear entirely, even when everything around it is working against it. Some things are simply ahead of their time, and ahead of their time is not the same as wrong. If this video made you think, subscribe to this channel today. More stories like this one are on the way, and you do not want to miss them. Leave a comment telling me what the Bond bug reminds you of from your own past. Like the video if it earned your time. And if you know someone who would enjoy this kind of history, share it with them right now. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.